Take a look at the female reproductive system today. So keep in mind that when we are looking at the female reproductive system, all structures and organs are internal. We are set up, or humans are set up for internal fertilization and internal development. So we are going to start taking a look by looking at the ovaries. We're going to kind of follow the path that an egg or an ovum would be taking during the course of a female reproductive cycle or during the menstrual cycle. So here on this diagram, and really both diagrams that we have on this page, if you have structure A on both of them, here's your side view of the female reproductive tract, and here is a front view of the female reproductive tract. This side view over here is giving you the bladder, the urinary bladder, as a point of reference. So you can see that the uterus is sitting just behind the urinary bladder. And unlike male reproductive systems, you are looking at the urethra as being a separate opening. So remember, in male reproductive systems, this tube here, the urethra, was a shared exit for both the reproductive system as well as the excretory system. In females, those two things are separate. Okay, so back up to the ovaries, which is the topic of this slide. The ovaries are labeled A in both structures, and that is going to be where eggs are made through that process of meiosis. Remember, eggs are the female gamete. Well, that's interesting. So that is a gamete, one of those vocab terms that you have. Right, sperm is the male gamete, eggs are the female gamete. Now, ovaries have a second function, and that is to produce female hormones of estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen is associated with those secondary sex characteristics that we talked about with males. So males produce testosterone, and that's responsible for their secondary sex characteristics of increased body hair, deeper voice, lower body fat. Estrogen is responsible for secondary sex characteristics of females. So things like higher body fat, not as much body hair, as well as the development of breast tissue. Now, progesterone is another hormone that the ovary will produce, but that is only going to get produced in high amounts if there is a pregnancy. And we'll talk more about that as we kind of move into the next subtopic. All right, so in our, there, got what I wanted. All right, as an egg develops and matures in the ovary, then it will be released about halfway through the menstrual cycle in a process known as ovulation. And it will be ovulated from the ovary into the fallopian tube. Sorry about that. Well, I guess I'm not getting that back. Into the fallopian tube, which they're showing you here labeled as F. All right, and that fallopian tube is also known as an oviduct. When an egg is released into the oviduct, if there is sperm present in the oviduct, then that is going to be where fertilization is going to take place. And I don't particularly love this diagram for this conversation, but this one right down here works pretty nicely. So if you can kind of focus over here for a second. If I'm looking at the ovary here, it's releasing that egg through the process of ovulation into the fallopian tube, and then it travels through that fallopian tube. If there is sperm present, which means that it's already made its way up through the vagina, through the cervix, through the uterus, and into the fallopian tube, then that is where fertilization takes place. By the time an egg gets into the uterus after ovulation, it's already no longer viable. It can't be fertilized any longer. Now, very common question that might be asked would be, what would happen if there was a blockage here at the fallopian tube? And that would prevent a pregnancy from occurring. Okay, so all right, so as we talked before, all right, so as we discussed, you have A here is your ovary, and it's maturing eggs or ova, the female gamete. That egg is going to be released through the process of ovulation about halfway through the female menstrual cycle, and then will travel down the fallopian tube to the uterus. If that egg has been fertilized within the fallopian tube, and it will implant in the lining of the uterus and then develop into a pregnancy, right? It'll start with an embryo, which will develop into a fetus, and we'll look more about what those early stages look like in the next video. If there is no pregnancy, then the ovary stops producing progesterone, and the uterus, which is structure C, and I'm outlining for you the uterus, loses its lining, and any of that lining and the blood vessels that are in there get removed through C, which is actually not labeled, so this is like E, the cervix, which is the opening of the uterus into the vagina, and then move out through the vagina. If there is a pregnancy, then that uterine lining stays and becomes thicker and thicker as the baby starts to produce, or the embryo starts to produce a placenta, and then the embryo will continue to develop. Now, one of the things that I do just want to draw your attention to is some of the pieces of that menstrual cycle. Get rid of that for a second. Oh, good. That actually cooperated. That's nice. It's nice when things work. All right. So the menstrual cycle begins for females at puberty and ends at menopause. Unlike males, where males are able to reproduce at the start of, or they start producing viable sperm at the beginning of puberty and then continue to do so for the remainder of their lifetime, females have a set period of time that they can reproduce, and that is from puberty to menopause. And menopause would be sort of the end of your reproductive window, I guess you could call it. Now, a menstrual cycle on average is 28 days. Remember, there's only one way to get averages. That means you have people who are above that and people who are below that. And it has several different pieces to it. So if you're looking at this graph, which is very overwhelming to look at for the first time, there are events that are happening in the ovary, which deal with the maturation of an egg. And then there are events happening in the uterus. So if I'm looking at just section A up at the top, section A is looking at maturing a follicle or maturing the cells that are around an egg. So if you get all the way, so I'm looking at making this egg more and more mature, more and more ready to potentially become pregnant. At around day 14, that egg is ovulated and then, ovulated into a fallopian tube. That egg would then be traveling down the fallopian tube, waiting to become fertilized by sperm that would be present in the fallopian tube. And if that doesn't, well, we'll leave that there. While sorry, so the rest of this is probably kind of confusing to look at. This is a structure called the corpus luteum. And that corpus luteum is what's going to produce progesterone. So this will hang around so long as there is that egg gets fertilized. If the egg does become fertilized, it will send a message back to the ovary to continue producing progesterone. If the egg's not fertilized, then that message doesn't go back to the ovary, and the ovary stops producing progesterone, and then the uterine lining would be lost. I'm going to move down here to section C. So this is starting on day 0, which would be the first day of the menstrual cycle, or the day that the uterine lining begins to be shed. That's also known as a period. So you're looking at that uterine lining being lost from about day 0 to about day 5. This one has you kind of stopping at around day 4. And then from that point on, you're looking at that uterine lining becoming thicker and thicker and thicker in preparation for a potential pregnancy. By the time the egg reaches the uterus, which is around day 24, if that egg is fertilized, then that egg is sending a message back to the ovary is sending a message of progesterone back to the uterus and telling the uterus to hang on to the uterine lining. That's not what's happening in this diagram. In this diagram, this would there is no fertilized egg, and that would signal for the lining of the uterus to be lost and shed so that it can prep for another potential pregnancy, for another egg to be matured in the following month. This is all controlled by 4 hormones. I don't necessarily care that you know the names of the hormones other than estrogen and associating estrogen with female characteristics. But it is important that you understand that the menstrual cycle is regulated by hormones. I realize that that's a really overwhelming graph to look at. I'm not really sure that any of these are much better for you to look at. They're all fairly overwhelming. This is pretty much just the same thing in color. And I think we're going to call this a day. All right, guys, till next time.